Hi, good evening. Hello. Hi. Thank you. I'm Joanna Marsh, the James Dickey Curator of Contemporary Art, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the American Art Museum this evening. Tonight's panel discussion is organized in conjunction with the temporary exhibition, The Singing and the Silence, Birds in Contemporary Art, which is currently on view through February 22nd in our third floor galleries. This exhibition examines our relationship to birds and the natural world through the eyes of 12 contemporary artists. The presentation of The Singing and the Silence coincides with two significant environmental anniversaries: the extinction of the passenger pigeon in 1914 and the establishment of the Wilderness Act in 1964. Separated by a mere 50 years, these two events serve to highlight mankind's journey from conquest of the land to conservation of it. Although human activity has affected many species, birds in particular represent these competing impulses and serve as a barometer for our current environmental health and cultural condition. Over the last 20 years, the steady rise in environmental consciousness has led to a resurgence of popular interest in the winged wonders that surround us daily. Darting from one perch to the next, they hover between earth and sky, city and wilderness, abundance and extinction. Their flight, their feathers, their singing, and their silence has inspired artists for generations. The exhibition brings together 12 artists, as I said, who explore the interplay between human and avian life, from the ecological to the ornithological, the spiritual, and the allegorical. We're joined this evening by 3 of the 12 artists in the exhibition: Petah Coyne, Laurel Roth Hope, and Fred Tomaselli. Our program tonight will be divided into 3 parts. First, each artist will give a brief overview of their work, describing their inspiration and influences. Following the presentations, each of the 3 artists will join me on the stage for a round-robin conversation about their practice and how their work intersects with the themes of the exhibition. Finally, we will entertain questions from the audience. Before inviting our first speaker to the podium, I'll provide a brief introduction for our distinguished guests and a glimpse of their work on view in The Singing and the Silence. Petah Coyne was born in Oklahoma City in 1953 and lives and works in New York and New Jersey. She is often referred to as the queen of mixed media for her elaborate installations that involve an ever-changing array of unorthodox materials, from human hair to silk flowers and religious statuary. Coyne derives inspiration from a range of sources, including literature, film, theology, art history, and personal memory. She began incorporating taxidermy into her work during the mid-1990s, and bird specimens in particular can be found in many of her recent sculptures, representing themes of life, death, remembrance, and renewal. Coyne's work has been exhibited worldwide and was the subject of a major solo exhibition at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art in 2010. Several of her monumental sculptures were also recently featured in the exhibition Late Harvest at the Nevada Museum of Art. Laurel Roth Hope was born in Concord, California in oops, how'd that happen? Sorry, guys. Laurel Roth Hope was born in Concord, California in 1973 and works in San Francisco. Before embarking on a career in the arts, she worked in natural resource conservation and served as a park ranger in Marin County, California. Her time spent protecting and restoring habitats has inspired a varied body of work that examines the relationship between humankind and nature, touching on topics such as environmental protection, animal behavior, and species extinction. Roth Hope employs a wide range of techniques, from crochet and assemblage to direct carving, to transform ordinary materials into elaborate animal sculptures that are both playful and poignant. Laurel's work was recently acquired by the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art and included in their state-of-the-art exhibition. and Fred Tomaselli, was born in Santa Monica, California in 1956 and received his bachelor's from California State University in Fullerton. He currently lives and works in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Tomaselli draws upon decorative traditions from around the world to create richly detailed paintings that pulsate with both abstract and figurative forms. An avid and idiosyncratic collector who's interested in both botany and ornithology, Tomaselli's visually packed works also comprise a hybrid of materials. A single piece may consist of brightly colored passages of paint, photo collage, found images from field guides and magazines, as well as hallucinogenic plants and prescription pills. Tomaselli's work has been shown extensively and is currently the subject of an exhibition at the Orange County Museum of Art. Now please join me in welcoming Petah Coyne to the stage.
Well, it's so black out there. Well, I'm thrilled to be here at the Smithsonian Museum. This has always been a very favorite museum of mine. Ever since I was a child, I really have always loved this museum. I come here every time I come to Washington, D.C., and I must say that it's changed drastically in the last 15 years, mostly because of Elizabeth and Virginia and, of course, Joanna. So I was really thrilled when Joanna called and invited me into this exhibition. I hope all of you get upstairs to see the exhibition and to really look at all the artists that are included in it. And we were talking before the panel started just about how it really flows from one artist to the other. And so it's unusual to have a group show that happens. So I know I have 15 minutes, and I will get it done in 15 minutes. My father's a general in the Army. I never fail at such things. So what I thought I would do is we'll go on a road trip, and I'll talk about sort of memories. I'll tell you some stories. I'll talk a little bit about my work. And while I'm doing this, I'll just kind of have these billboard images kind of go by of my work. And I think that's the most economical way to sort of do this and have things happen. I was raised an Army brat, as you probably heard me refer to my father. We moved 15 times before I was even 12 years old. And my parents made it really fun. But I also have to say that when the military moves you, 15, 20 men come into your house, they just pack you up. If you have trash in your trash can, it goes to your next house. And it's so much, see, someone else is out there. And it's so much fun. They take the chandeliers down, they pack them in straw and hay, and it goes to your next house. And it prepares you to be a contemporary sculptor who's always moving things, right? And my mother was also crazy about education. She wanted us to learn. She really wanted us to hunger for knowledge. And she wanted us to see anything that was unusual, anything that was out of the ordinary. But I will say my mother didn't really care so much about school, which would have gotten us in a lot of trouble had we been located in one place. And but we weren't. So the biggest memory that I can remember, the earliest, was when we lived in Hawaii and there was a beached whale on Waikiki. She went and got us all out of school, and we spent the day at the beach. And it was so much fun because the men there were getting nets over this whale, and this whale was huge. To date, it is still the biggest animal I have ever seen. It was very sick, but the men were still trying to get nets around it so that when high tide would come in, they would be able to get him to get back out into the ocean. And his eye was massive, and it would open, and he would look at us. And I just kept thinking, he must think we're like little tiny ants, just like scurrying around, like, what are they doing? And he had these amazing marks across him, scars, deep scars. And my mom said, each one has a story, has a story about his life in the ocean. And can you imagine what those stories would be? And can you make up your own stories? And then she took us back to our Japanese beautiful gardens that overlooked Honolulu, and she read to us Moby Dick. And I was 5 years old, and I still remember that this was the first time that a great visual event and great literature really went together, and it wouldn't be the last. And this image right here, you may not probably recognize what exactly it is, but it's a 1950s Airstream trailer that I had shredded. And when I first had it shredded, I looked at it, I thought, oh gosh, it looks like my mother's hair. And of course now it looks like mine. Of course not with the blue, but there it is. It was used as a performance piece and in the 90s, but now it's actually in Brazil. But it'll come home. Going on, we're gonna go down the road, right? I can't stop. My mother was also an ikebana master. And for those of you that don't know what that is, that's formal Japanese flower arranging. And we would go on expeditions for materials. And so we would go to the desert or the forest or the beach. And what she would do is she would say, now I want you to scatter and go find really amazing things. Like there's hundreds of pine cones here, but I want you to find the most unusual ones. And we would go and we would look and we would try to find really unusual pine cones. And we would take them to her and she would say, well, no, why would you bring that to me? That's not quite so unusual. And so we'd be like, no, it's not. We'd throw it away and we'd be out again to look for unusual pine cones. And then we would bring it to her and we'd say, how about this? And she'd go, now that's an unusual pine cone. And so we would take it back home and she would make these worlds, these beautiful worlds of just amazement with just 3 objects. The Japanese really liked to make very, very simple thing. It was very minimal. And she would say, now I want you to make a comment about this world that I've made. And so we'd all want to say something very smart. And she'd say, not so quick. I want you to really look. You don't speak before you really think. So we'd all concentrate really hard on what this world that she'd made. And then she'd say, now watch this. And she'd take this world that she'd made and she would just turn it just a quarter of a turn. And this world would have changed drastically. And this was a metaphor not just for this world, but I think for the whole world. And it was, she really taught us so much with so little. The whole time we were traveling, we traveled by ocean liner, we traveled by plane, we traveled by car. She read to us great literature. Nothing was too adult for us. But of course, our favorite, was Dickens. This man could write about characters that just would blow your mind. And my favorite, Miss Havisham, of course, right? Hello. Who didn't love a woman that only wore one shoe? And she was left at the altar, and she didn't try to hide it. No, no, no. She left her wedding cake on the table for 40 years. She let the rats eat it. She wore her wedding dress. I mean, this was not Downton Abbey, right? She wore her wedding dress, and as she got older and she got middle age and the fat began to spill out of the seams that were ripped, she didn't care. She just didn't care. I would not do that. I don't think many of you would do that, but she didn't care. And I thought that was really beautiful. And it made me begin to think, is it more beautiful to have a party and celebrate and have it be beautiful? Or is it more beautiful the day after, when there's crumbs everywhere and there's glasses turned over and the wine bottles spilled? Or is it more beautiful when you look at something like House and Gardens? Or is it more beautiful when you think of hoarders and their life? I mean, there's something really beautiful about the residue of life lived and all that stuff piled up. I mean, I think about it a lot. Maybe I shouldn't, but I do. Now, when people write about my work, they often write about the sadness, they write about the darkness, they write about death. But when I look at my work, I see love. And since this is February and it's the month of love, I thought I would point to the love in my work. Now, the piece that's upstairs is called Beatrice. And as you know, Dante loved Beatrice. Now, some scholars say that he only saw Beatrice just a moment, dressed in vermilion, darting around a corner, and he fell madly in love with her. That was it for him. He loved her forever, but she was betrothed. He could never, ever have her. And so I built Beatrice. She's up very high. She's covered in velvet, in navy blue and purple velvet, of course from Venice, the best money could buy. And if you can look around, and you have to move around the sculpture, right? And you'll see all these different tableaus of the birds diving into the sea of love. Another piece, No Reason Except Love, right? And it's about Tom White and his wife, Leslie Scalapino, and they'd been married since college. And then she died, and she's such a wonderful poet. And when she passed, I think the color of life just was drained from so many of us. And so I had all these birds, and all the birds have no color. You rarely see birds with no color, and all the birds have no color. And I have them in a field of flowers, and the flowers are the color of bruises, because when someone leaves, when someone passes, I feel as if we've been beaten up. I feel as if we've been bruised. And the last piece that I'll talk about is this piece about my parents. And they, too, married right after college. God bless, they're still alive. They're both pushing 100. And they're in an assisted living area. They live in separate parts, but every single day they insist on being together. And some days they sit and they giggle and they talk and they hold hands. And other days they just sit knee to knee and they stare in each other's eyes and they don't say a word. Thank you. Sorry.
That's okay. You can do it. Thank you, that was great. So my name's Laurel Roth Hope, and as Joanna was saying, I'm going to start this by telling you a little bit about myself and how I got started making the work that I do. I'm a self-taught artist who used to work as a park ranger in natural resources. That basically means that I spent as much time cleaning public bathrooms, mowing lawns, and breaking up fights in parking lots as I actually did removing invasive plant species or building trails. I've always had a strong affinity for nature, and I never minded getting my hands dirty. So how I went from doing a job that I loved, which was being a park ranger, to doing a job that I love even more, which is being an artist, started one day when I was picking up trash along the San Pablo Bay. And along with the usual plastic bags and random garbage, there was a little red ball that had washed up from the bay. I kept it because I thought it had an interesting texture, and I didn't know what it was, and I wanted to know what it was made out of. So after work, I cut into it with a Dremel that I just bought, and it turned out to be an old billiard ball, which is made of solid resin. And I started cutting and carving and playing with it until I'd carved a little bird skeleton modeled on a finch skull that I'd found in an owl pellet in one of the parks. So that's my first sculpture, and I'm starting with that because you got to start somewhere. I'd done a fair bit of painting up until that point on the side, but I grew up in a lower working class background that didn't actually have much exposure to art, and it always stressed practicality over creativity for understandable reasons. So I painted as an outlet and I sketched, but I'd never actually found my creative voice until I started carving. Sculpture gave me a framework to think and explore the world that really just blew up for me. I just moved to the city of San Francisco, and I needed something to help inspire me to adapt to my new surroundings. I started looking at animals that live in cities and trying to find patterns that I would have found in nature. I was trying to use my park ranger skills to help me adapt to my new surroundings. I started making little animal sculptures, and I made them out of garbage with the idea that a form of super adaptation was allowing them to speed up nutrient cycling to the point that they would assemble themselves out of garbage before it biodegraded into its chemical components. And those were my first sculptures, and they were a fun start, but it rapidly got more interesting and complicated as I was learning, probably in part because I'd been holding back that creative impulse for so long. Making things is how I think the most clearly, and it's how I can see things both literally and figuratively from multiple perspectives in order to learn about them. So hopefully you all got a chance to see the show. I think it's really timely and beautiful, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. I have 6 pieces in the show from 2 different series that I work on that are about birds, and I'll talk about the peacocks first. So I've been making this series of sculptures for about 7 years. They're made of carved wood and steel rod frames supporting approximately 600 to 1,000 fake fingernails, all hand-filed and painted, and between 1,500 and 2,000 barrettes, and costume jewelry and false eyelashes. And I call this their mating plumage. So in nature, it's usually the male animals that grow more extreme biological ornamentation in order to show their potential value as mates. Some also build very elaborate stages and perform intricate dances in order to attract females. And it's sometimes known as the handicap principle because having a large, heavy tail makes it harder to fly and escape predators, and it takes up valuable resources. But the payback is that in nature, peahens tend to choose the peacocks with the largest number of eye spots on their tails to mate with, because only the healthiest males with the best access to resources can afford to grow such elaborate plumage. It shows that the bird has health and resources beyond mere survival needs, and so it communicates better value genetics to pass on to their offspring. So my peacocks use adornment that's more typically associated with human females. Humans also engage in displays to show our value as mates. We tend to think of ourselves as making independent choices about our choices about our everyday appearances. But quite often those choices are also silently communicating our place in the natural systems that we take part in order to survive as a species. So long fingernails, high heels, dangly earrings, all of these make it harder to do the physical work of survival on some level, but they're also eye-catching. And like a beautiful tail of feathers, they show that the wearer is so successful that they have extra resources and they don't have to worry about just running away. And that's obviously a simplification, but relating human mating plumage to bird mating plumage is one way to reinforce that humankind is part of a larger system. So one theme that I touch on a lot in my work is human choice. The more we find out about animal emotion and intelligence, the harder it is to make a clear line that places us on one side and the rest of animals on the other. Many animals, including birds, use tools, and even prairie dogs are now known to have complex forms of vocal communication. But the one thing that we humans do seem to have is a unique complexity of thought that includes the ability to choose our involvement in natural processes. The other animals usually engage in according to instinct or season. So we can choose what we eat, whether we mate, and when and with whom, where we live and how we shelter our bodies. And we can take a wide variety of variables into mind when we make those choices. So we engage in all the same systems as the rest of the animal world, but the one marked difference is that we often create moral systems of right and wrong to help us make those choices. And those systems have led us to a point in time where humankind is so successful as a species that we're a force of nature ourselves. Some scientists call it the Anthropocene, or the geological epoch that began when human activities began to significantly impact the Earth's ecosystems. So most of the sculpture that I make comes about from me trying to understand and navigate this from multiple perspectives while still retaining the sense of wonder that nature gives me. So the other series that I have in the show, oops, I got a little behind there, is called Biodiversity Reclamation Suits for Urban Pigeons. And these are little suits that mimic the plumage of extinct birds that I crochet and I put on pigeon mannequins to visually recreate lost biodiversity. So by disguising the common pigeon as an extinct bird, the perceived value of the pigeon is increased at the same time as I'm putting a little cozy over environmental concerns. And originally I thought that I'd put them on hunting decoys to save time because everything I make takes far too long. But I couldn't find any mass-produced decoys of good enough quality, so I started carving my own pigeon mannequins out of wood. So much for saving time. Now I also carve and cast individual components of pigeon from resin so that I can assemble them into unique mannequins. And one of the interesting things about this process is that when I started, I thought I knew what pigeons looked like. But going through it taught me that I really had only a vague idea of how a pigeon was really put together, despite seeing them all the time. And I have a much better sense of them now. But I still annoy my husband when we're out walking the dog by stopping to look at pretty much every single one. I crochet the suits with mostly fine gauge cotton, silk, and wool, yarn, and thread. And I make up the patterns for each one as I go, tearing them out and redoing them until I get the shape and stitch patterns and color interactions all the way I want them. I haven't written down any of the patterns, and I don't plan to. Each one is different, even if I remake the same species. The gauge of the yarn is so small that each one has nearly the amount of stitches as a full-sized human sweater. Obviously, I'm not the fastest worker. But crochet works really well for these because it's got great sculptural possibility and a foundation in math. There's an ability to mimic the Fibonacci-like increasing and decreasing of feather patterns that works perfectly. And crochet also has a long history of being used for comfort and protection that fits well with my thinking behind these pieces. So for the pigeon suits, I've mostly focused on birds that have gone extinct as a direct result of human activity, most within the last 150 or so years. So far, I've crocheted the dodo, the passenger pigeon, Carolina parakeet, paradise parrot, all of which were in this show, as well as the ivory-billed woodpecker, Guadalupe caracara, the great auk, and the heath hens. There's a certain martyr-like quality to animals like the dodo, who evolved without predators, and so were defenseless against the changes that we brought to their landscape. Their trust in the world and their inability to adapt to us brought them to their extinction, where pigeons, at the other end of the spectrum, thrive in most cities in the world. They're remarkably adaptable to urban environments. They say that the urban environments mimic the rocky cliffs that they originally inhabited, and they're very, very successful as a species. So part of my thinking behind the biodiversity suits is a play on quantity versus perceived value. The The animals that fail to adapt to changes we make in the environment are gone, and they're beyond value because of this shortage. Often the last surviving individuals of a species would actually be hunted specifically because they were the last ones, so they were more valuable. The animals that adapt readily to urban environments thrive, and they're often vilified for their success. Because they're so numerous and because they share our territory, they're often treated with disgust if they're noticed at all. So the danger of working with a topic like extinction or any environmental theme is that you risk beating people over the head with environmental rhetoric. Feeling hopeless is rarely a catalyst for positive change. So with this series, I've been trying to approach extinction, which is one of the most heartbreaking topics that I can think of, from a different angle, one that doesn't entirely lose a sense of humor or beauty. Obviously, a tiny sweater isn't going to bring back an extinct species, and even cutting-edge genetic research that promises to bring back extinct species like the passenger pigeon can't restore the habitat that it would take to reestablish itself as a species. But I don't want to make work that depresses people, because I think getting too much of that makes our minds go numb, and we become helpless when we become hopeless. I want to share things that I think are exciting, and hope that maybe it encourages people to keep in mind the fact that we're part of something vast, beautiful, and fragile. So to me, the show that Joanna curated does a wonderful job of this, because birds are especially poignant as symbols, and flight has always represented something that's just out of reach, but it's so easy to imagine and wish for. Birds are both alien, but they're also often the only wildlife that we might see on a daily basis. So this year, I'm starting work on a piece about the introduction of the European starling to the United States. In 1890, the American Acclimatization Society released 60 starlings in Shakespeare's garden in New York in an effort to populate the garden with all of the birds that Shakespeare mentioned in his plays. 40 more were released the next year, and within 10 years, they'd firmly established themselves throughout New York, and since then, they've spread across the continent and flourished until they now comprise the largest biomass of avian life in North America, over 200 million strong. So in effect, in the 100 years since the extinction of the passenger pigeon, this introduced species has replaced them as our most populous bird. And who knows what's going to happen in the next 100 years. So in closing, I hope that you enjoyed my work in the show, and hopefully this provided some background to it. It was very much an honor to show with artists like Fred and Petah, whose work I've loved for many years. Thanks.
Hi, thanks for coming. I just got a chance to look at the show, and it's fantastic, and I'm really happy to be in the show with Laurel and Petah and so many other great artists. So anyway, while I do love birds, birds are not actually the primary focus of my work. It primarily involves issues in and around perception. I guess it started with this idea of the pre-modernist ideal of paintings as windows to other realities, and this idea of losing yourself in this other space that's represented within the picture into this maybe a transcendent or sublime space. And in that kind of rhetoric, it almost treats paintings as transportational vehicles to take you to other dimensions. And I thought that really reminded me a lot around the rhetoric around psychedelic drugs and around drugs in general, and something that I have a little bit of personal experience with, and the corollaries between the pre-modernist rhetoric about other dimensions and then this other more this rhetoric that was rooted more in the sociology around my life seemed so uncanny that I thought I would explore that. I should preface all this by saying that before I found myself becoming an accidental painter, I had abandoned it because of the burden of history. Yeah, I just didn't feel like I could make a good picture, or I didn't feel like I had I just didn't feel like I could wait that long. So I was working primarily in performance and installation work. And then, so anyway, I started thinking about this idea of what pictures do to people, how they can rearrange perception. And so around 1989, I started inlaying pharmaceuticals into wood and then resining them over. And I guess I wanted to rearrange the use value around those objects. So instead of traveling through the bloodstream to alter consciousness, they traveled through the eyeballs. It was a different route to altering consciousness, a different route to the brain. And so this is an early work from 1990. It's called 13,000. It's made out of aspirin. And at that time, I guess, I was firmly rooted in kind of conceptual practice, and at that point, I was, more or less executing ideas that I had, and I was mostly working within sort of the parameters of geometric abstraction. And so then, I worked for quite a while with pharmaceuticals, mostly over the counter, just generic pills, and then I thought, well, I needed to put in. I want to put in something that has more of a subcultural drug connotation, because I sort of felt like whether it was pharmacological culture or whether it was subcultural drugs, whether it was drugs that made you feel better, physically, or whether they altered your consciousness or made you feel better mentally, I felt like it was all about the same thing. So anyway, I started growing marijuana to insert into my work. And so this is an earliest work called "I Could See Your Voice," and it's sort of it's primarily it's sort of about synesthesia in that it's sort of these sort of pulsating lines sort of represent sort of the visualization of audio material. But the funny thing about pot was that it inserted the shape of nature into my work. And in a funny way, growing pot became the gateway to me pouring more nature into my work and getting more involved in gardening. So this is my garden, actually. And this is where a lot of the material from the botanical specimens from my garden actually end up from there into my work. And this is Datura, for instance. I collected that seed pod in New Mexico. It's a favorite plant of Georgia O'Keeffe, and it's highly popular in the metal community because it puts you into contact with the principalities of darkness. And but I've never taken it because I don't like the principalities of darkness. But so anyway, so these are the plant. I press like a Victorian. I press these plant specimens in these plant presses, then put them in these loose leaf binders, and then I turn them into things. This is an early work. This is a work I was really embarrassed when I made it, and I hid it for a while. It's called Superplant, and it's the shape of it is based both on Rajasthani miniature floral patterns and also the Shaker Tree of Life. But I'm going to use my pointer. The reason I call it Superplant is let me go back. It's actually a hybrid of 6 different botanical specimens. So it's got, okay, yeah. So this is like tobacco leaves, and those little dots are morning glory seeds, which contain an indole related to LSD. The stem is made out of ephedra. These are hemp leaves. There's coffee beans, and there's psilocybin mushrooms. So the reason I call it Superplant is if it ever existed, it would rule the world. Anyway, so I was working with all, the resining I learned growing up in Southern California when I was a surfboard shaper, and the inlay I learned, as in my job as a woodworker. I did a lot of woodworking, and a lot of other blue-collar type jobs. So a lot of the techniques I use actually come out of the sort of more blue-collar, working-class background of the garage. But anyway, my friend Nicole Eisman asked me, and I think it was in 1993, to help her to insert a work in her mural at the Whitney Biennial, and so we thought we would make a joke and play around with Van Gogh's Starry Night, and that actually led to me using photo collage, and so then the photography became a bigger part of my work after that. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about birds, because I'm going to show about birds. I remember I was with my brother. We were camping in the Devil's Punch Bowl, which is the deepest fissure in the San Andreas Fault in Southern California. And we were going to hike up to this mountain. And he said, well, he's this big birder. He's a member of the Audubon Society, does a Christmas bird count and everything. He's like, okay, he had these bird books, and he's like, we're going to see a western tanager. This is a really good spot to see western tanager. And he showed me the picture, and it looked really cool. And then he said, and we're going to see a pileated woodpecker. I know this is great habitat for pileated woodpeckers. I was like, okay, cool. So he gave me some binoculars, and so I was out there on the trail. I had seen all this stuff, and then I was looking through these binoculars, and there was a pileated woodpecker. And there was a western tanager, and they both blew my mind. And before that, birds were just like dirt in the sky. They didn't really, I didn't really see them. And then I realized that, with enhanced optics and a little bit of knowledge, this parallel reality that I'd lived in all my life was opened up to me. And because of my interest in parallel realities, it just, and my interest in perception and the way I see, how paintings function, it just seemed like it was just, I don't know, perfect for my mind. And I sort of became a birder after that. I'm not super hardcore, but when I meet really hardcore birders, they tend to be sort of Aspergian. But but I am this guy that keeps lists now and stuff, and I'm completely fascinated. So anyway, the shape of nature got into my work. These field guides started entering into my work. Basically, my work is an amalgamation of my hobbies and interests. And the more I accrue, the more it just goes into the work. And I guess you could say that in the 30-odd years that I've been making art, it's just basically a palimpsest of interests that's just stacked up on top of themselves. This work, for instance, this is from the late 90s. It's called Separation Event in Hybrid Garden. And I was working upstate in north of New York City in the woods, and because the resin needs to have really pristine conditions, what was happening was it was really buggy, so the bugs kept landing in my resin, and they would fly into the barn I was working in, and I was just so pissed off about it that I decided to drag my canvases out next to the river, aim these giant lights at them at night, and this huge storm of bugs gathered around the piece. And when they reached their apex, I poured my resin onto the work, and it acted like a big glue trap. And these bugs all stuck and died in random formations onto the surface of the work. And it basically became a portrait of the air, of the atmosphere at that particular moment. And then I kind of created a sort of inverse scenario where, in this case, they're hatching out of this cadaverous guy that in the grass. Although I've created all these hybrid critters that are mixtures of paint, pills, leaves, real bugs, and paintings of bugs. And so anyway, I'm just going to show you, I did a bunch of various things that were related to landscape and nature. I figured since I was creating these other worlds to go to, I would try to create these places that were important to me that I thought were inherently beautiful. This is a little painting I did based on a hiking trip I took in New Mexico in the Pecos National Forest, and the sort of psychedelic patterning around this tondo, which is dotted with saccharin, is the same landscape as in a map formation. So work in the show called Bird Blast. Um, and then, because, I have this sort of frugal working class background, I would cut out these field guides and I always had these voids left over. So I started inserting these sort of polar, Land's End catalog, polar fleece, and Gore-Tex outer layer sort of things. I wanted to conflate two ways of man gets to know nature, in our sort of petrochemically based outfits, reading our manuals, trying to name things. And I also maybe asking the question of what happened to the world that the birds needed to wear these kinds of outfits. So I did these in the late 90s and for a while. I don't know. Oh yeah, I know why this is here. This is here because for a while I went off into more narrative, figurative work. This is a work called Airborne Event. It's sort of based on Don DeLillo's White Noise, where there's this toxic airborne event that comes into the town, and I started thinking about how these toxic airborne events sort of being captured by the sky, sort of like space aliens capturing you, or the assumption of the Virgin Mary into heaven, or this sort of chemical chain. Actually, this started out as an abstraction, and then I took this left turn, and then she came out of that. But so I did a lot of those things, and then I started taking a similar technique, which is sort of based on sort of like the building process, kind of coming out of Arcimboldo, Giuseppe Arcimboldo, and started making these surrogates for human activities in the form of birds. So this is one called Hummingbird. And so basically these birds are being made actually out of the things they're consuming, in this case flowers. This one's called avian raptor serpent. And it's based on, a lot of this stuff is coming out of my life. And me and my wife and my kid were up in upstate again, and we watched a red-tailed hawk come down, pull a snake out of the grass, and eat it while it was alive. And for a second, it was the Mexican flag. It blew our minds, so I did a painting of it. So that's it. And it's like a snake composed of hundreds of snakes and so on and so forth. Another work in the show, sort of surrogates for sort of domestic couple. This was kind of came out of, I was in my backyard, because I'm this gardener now in my backyard in Brooklyn. There's always those horrible starlings who I hate. They're in my backyard and eating my figs all the time, and I'm always shooing them away. And I saw some birds in the fig tree. I was like, oh, the birds. So I ran out there to chase them off, and they were red-breasted grosbeaks, a bird that I hardly ever see, that were migrating through in fall. And so I let them eat my figs, and they're kind of common, in the Northeast, but I don't see them that often in Brooklyn. And to me, it was like this visitation from another dimension. So I sort of conflated that event and took my fig leaves from my tree, pressed them, put them in the piece, and put these long-tailed hummingbirds from South America, which I've never seen, in the piece. There they are. Another work that's not in the show is called Night Music for Raptors. And this is, basically I was kind of like, again, it's another work dealing sort of with synesthesia. I looked at these two eyeballs of this owl as almost like two turntables seen from above. And I sort of think about like these little concentric circles that are radiating out as being almost like notations from musical notes, or the stars at the night, or the hooting of the owl. And now that's in turn has now affected this newest body of work, which I'm just going to show you a couple pictures of. You can see how this is. I've been working on this New York Times project that's where I've been working on these for about 10 years off and on. And so in some cases, like this is Dick Durbin with Night Music for Raptors. And then this is a work I did last year or so, and based on a devastation of a tornado. And then this is a work that was based on that work. So now they're feeding, there's a feedback loop back and forth between these New York Times, which is a whole other project that I won't even bother trying to tell you about. But because of this sort of like ongoing project that I have with the news, a lot more Darwinian sort of interactions are starting to work, starting to enter into the work. And anyway, that's it. Thank you.
I think so. It seemed like it. Take one for yourself.
I've got one, thanks, sweetie.
Okay.
Is there a particular CD?
No, I'm just going to sit here, and you can sit there. You can sit anywhere. Perfect. Nice. Thank you. All three of you. That was fantastic. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, good. Okay. So I thought I'd start with a pretty basic question, which actually both Fred and Laurel addressed in your talks, which is how and when you started incorporating avian imagery into your work. So I'm going to turn to you, Petah, and ask you the same question. And I think I may have alluded to your use of taxidermy, which started in the maybe early or mid-90s. But can you trace back when you started to incorporate birds in particular?
I think maybe even earlier than that, when I think, I want to say when we did the Corcoran Museum show, probably in 92, 90, I can't remember what year it was, sorry.
And did they have at the time a particular significance?
Always
was there-
Honolulu.
Honolulu.
Yeah.
Okay. I remember when you and I were together just beginning to talk about this exhibition, that you told me another story about your mom, and I love these stories, about how each of the places that you would travel to, she would buy an ornament, a state bird, and hang it on your Christmas tree. And I wondered, that must have been internalized in some way. And
Not one ornament, the whole tree.
Oh, the whole tree.
The whole tree. So my mother was never, it's never simple, So like when we
Not
went,
just 3 pine
No,
cones,
no. It was like when we went to Dayton. It was like that was the cardinal. So it was like a white tree with all red cardinals on it. So whatever bird it was all that. That was the whole tree.
Right.
So yes, and look at my sculpture. The apple never falls too far. So it's the
Certainly
same.
hasn't.
Yes.
And the use of taxidermy in particular, can you talk a little bit about how you began to incorporate that material into the work?
The taxidermy, because someone threw, a museum actually threw away all their taxidermy into a dumpster, and someone told me about it, and I thought it was so, I often use recycled materials, and I thought it was so horrible. So we actually got it, and we began to, and that's how I began, and I thought it was so precious. It was Victorian taxidermy, so beautiful, and I thought it was just the best, and that was about 96, 97, and after that, I must say, I love it because it's so, and now museums call me and say they can't take care of it. Will I take it from them and take care of it for them?
And then it becomes incorporated into the work? Is that when you're called on to?
Yes, but I'm at the end now. I'm just about finished I'll use what I have and that's it. Yeah, I'm moving on to other things right now.
Well, this idea of repurposing materials is something that I wanted to engage all three of you about. Because while the work is so visually distinct, and it's actually kind of hard to have a panel discussion with the three of you because the work is so dramatically different. But what I think unifies you is this interest in sort of reclaiming materials, repurposing materials, working with unorthodox or even unimaginable objects. And I wondered if you could elaborate on sort of how that fuels your creative process.
I think in my case, I use a lot of different media, and it really depends on the series that I'm working on. I do the crochet, I do the peacocks, I do a lot of wood carving, and so it's got to work with what I'm working with. Like they both have to go together. So it's kind of hard to answer it, because each thing is so different. But repurposing materials is always good because I was a park ranger. I'm an environmentalist. I can't think about using entirely new toxic materials to make a piece. I've definitely bent that more over time because I don't want to only use, I don't want to restrict my practice to only using recycled materials.
And in the case where, like the peacocks, for instance, does the idea, the concept for the work come first, and then you seek out the fake fingernails and false eyelashes and barrettes, or is it a kind of simultaneous, more
That one,
organic process?
I saw the fake nails in a store, and it came pretty quickly, looking at them, looking at the shape, looking at the way they come in different sizes, so you can tile them. It happened, right away. I was working with birds a lot right then because it is one of the few animals that you see in a city on a daily basis. And so that happened very naturally. And those are not repurposed. They're not used because that would be disgusting. But the costume jewelry is all repurposed.
Yeah, I guess I was really interested in kind of in this ephemeral water-soluble material that kind of had a one-time use and then would evaporate. And I thought that it would be interesting to fix them forever, like bugs in amber, so that they could be repurposed and reused by each person over and over again forever. And so in a funny way, like using this resin process and sort of just fix them into this perpetual state of potentiality, and so that was how I got started. And I realized that ephemerality. It started with water soluble pills and leaves, and then went on to bugs. But then even with the newspaper work that I'm doing now, that's also another kind of ephemeral object that's already obsolete the moment it's printed. So I have this ridiculous archive at home, and now part of my
amazing. It's an amazing archive.
my now I have this I have every New York Times printed in the last 10 years in my studio. So I have all this stuff that's obsolete, and so I get to reuse it. So that's how it started.
Do you want to talk about some more of the unusual materials you work with? You mentioned the Airstream trailer in your remarks, and I know you've worked with human hair. And again, does the material come first, or the idea for the piece, and then you find a material that sort of suits the...
I think the material comes first. I love materials. And when I go lecture at universities, I always ask the graduate students to take me someplace that's very unusual. And they usually take me someplace where I find materials. And I'm always bringing truckloads of something back. And my buildings are bursting with materials. Yeah, so it's a problem, and but I love. And then it takes me about 2 years to figure out how to work the materials. But I love materials, and it's like speaking a language. Every time you get a new material, then you have to really struggle with it. And then once you get the language, you fight with it. And then once you finally get that material, where you can agree that you will work together, then you can start to make sculpture. It takes a long time.
I've read or heard you say that part of working with these materials is, or what you love about it is sort of animating the inanimate, or breathing new life into something that is obsolete. It's a little akin to what you've just described, Fred, also. And I certainly think that's true of the taxidermy that is incorporated into the work, that is literally breathed new life into.
I don't want to say it's religious, but it's very much a thing. I mean, it's like the soul is gone, but the body remains, and it feels, I don't know, there's something very special about it. and when I saw that they were throwing them away, it just seemed sacrilegious. You shouldn't do that. So I don't know. Even the dead fish from the early years, it just seemed horrible. They were eating all those dead fish. I don't know.
Can you describe the reference there a little bit more for our audience?
Oh, I used to collect dead fish, and I would go down. I would end up in Chinatown, and I would spend all my money on dead fish. Every Friday, I got paid, and I would buy dead fish until I ended up having thousands and thousands of dead fish in my loft, and it just was. It was an obsession.
Without refrigeration?
Without refrigeration. They were
And your
hanging.
neighbors?
My neighbors, thank God they loved me, but it was very intense. It was a difficult time for all of us.
Did you make work out of the dead fish?
I did a number of pieces. That was that fight I was talking about, and we hung it on the streets of New York. I loved it so much, and I actually didn't know what to do with it because my husband's eyes started closing up with infection. So I thought it would be a good idea to take it and give it as a gift to someone. And so I took it to Garden City in Long Island. Doesn't that sound pretty? And so a couple of us went out there and we did a yard. And we covered the trees and the car and the flower boxes. And we just did a most beautiful gift. And but I learned really quickly that it was so beautiful. You know, when you're working in your studio, you see your work very differently than the people on the outside. And it sounds insane, I know, but to me, they were really beautiful. And I could show you pictures someday, but they really were beautiful. And but it was the last time I did anything without being asked. So, anyway.
I'm sensing a theme here. I think you referred to it earlier as hoarding. I'll call it collecting because I think that's
Collecting
nicer.
is nicer.
Laurel, are you a collector?
Yeah, my studio is less than 200 square feet, so I can't collect too much. But I definitely I have models of all the different skulls that I work with, which is actually kind of interesting because people come in and they assume a certain morbidity, where to me they don't represent that at all. If anything, they almost represent something more either emblematic of a species instead of a personal, like an individual animal, or something almost more of a spirit that remains after everything else is gone. Mm-hmm. So it's always a little strange when also people see that I have different models of skulls and then they start bringing me roadkill, which I don't really want. But yeah, mostly models and things to work from and wood, because it's hard to get really nice chunks of wood. Mm-hmm. So I tend to hoard those.
So now this is reminding me of our conversation earlier. Would you be willing to share what you told me is in your freezer?
Okay, out with it.
Yeah, we have a bunch of dead migratory birds in our freezer.
Oh.
And many of them have run into plate glass windows and passed away. And you know, they're in little salt coffins. And every now and then there's like there's a golden crowned kinglet, two white-throated sparrows, ruby-throated hummingbird. So every now and then we look at them, and our guests think we're insane. But they're there in the freezer.
And
they look just as good today as they did 20 years ago.
The reason we were talking about this earlier, it does seem an odd subject, is because we were talking about this sort of moment of contact or sort of intimacy with an animal, in this case a bird. And that's pictured in a few instances in the exhibition and the work of Barbara Bosworth, and that's how we were talking about it. These they're so rare. Birds surround us, as we've all said, in our daily life, and are often the sort of only link to what's left of the American wilderness. But it's so seldom that you have this moment of physical contact with a bird, and it's such a sort of precious, fleeting moment.
Yeah, it's fascinating. In New York City, during the migratory season, you can see more birds there coming through New York than you can out in the country, because the parks act as giant bird funnels. So Prospect Park or Central Park become insane with birds. So it really, nature really does have this tendency to still swamp this concrete jungle. And, birders come from all over the world. And like, I've been to Central Park early in the morning, where I'll be there and there'll be literally 500, hermit thrushes who had flown all night, and then they're all there in the park that morning. They're all blinking and all messed up, like looking for bugs, freaking out, and they're like literally every 5 feet. And then that night they'll all move on, and then they'll be replaced by something else. So it's interesting to live in the city, and if you have this connection to the avian life, to have this connection with nature roaring through. So it's kind of, I like that.
That's exactly. So you've just answered the next question I was going to ask all of you, which is how living in an urban environment but making work that is so much about nature and the natural world, how that experience of being in the city has impacted the work. So you've answered
that one
question
and my garden.
Yeah.
And I take a lot of trips to nature. So.
How about you, Laurel?
I actually live part-time out in the redwoods, so that helps a lot. Maybe 2/3 the time in San Francisco and 2/3 the time in second growth redwood forest. But I think that being in the city, when I was a park ranger, I was definitely a little bit more elitist about what I thought of as wilderness and what I thought of as wildlife. And living in the city, I've had to kind of change my thinking and learn to appreciate things that I wouldn't have otherwise, like pigeons, which I'm now kind of fascinated by, and I'm in danger of becoming one of those crazy pigeon ladies. And I probably wouldn't have looked at them at all, if I hadn't had to find something to focus on.
Right. And the starling, I guess, as well.
That's the next one.
Petah, how about you?
No, I'm just in my studio. I'm not a gardener. I get poison ivy. I'm just like, I do nature films.
That works too.
That does.
Yeah.
Well, one of the last questions, or maybe second to last question, I'll ask each of you before we open it up to the audience. I was thinking as I was listening to you speak, and I think maybe Laurel and Fred, and even Petah a little bit, you each addressed this with this idea of birds as sort of surrogates for humans in your work. And I guess I wondered if you would elaborate that on a little bit. Fred, you alluded to it with the piece Migrant Fruit Thugs, talking about those as sort of stand-ins for you and your wife. But are there other examples?
In my work?
Yeah.
I think that like all the birds that have appeared in my work have some corollary to human behavior. Whether it's working like in my way, I think, like with the avian flower serpent, the red-tailed hawk with the snake. It sort of felt like like Dad coming home from a long, and then there's eating. Like all these sort of things that people do. I just sort of find corollaries with birds. But I don't want to make too big of a deal about that. I mean, there's other things that are percolating in there simultaneously, but that's just one of the threads that maybe got me there.
Well, you and I were talking when we walked through the exhibition also about this idea of sort of adaptation and how humans adapt to the natural world, and of course that sort of is teased out in those images of the field guide cutouts with the Land's End catalogs behind them.
That's right, and in the work in the show, natural
Exactly.
selection, there's a combination of normally plumaged birds mixed with fake birds made out of the Gore-Tex polar fleece that are trying to match their new environment, which is this sort of the background behind this tree shape is all this sort of like Gore-Tex world. So they're trying to sort of camouflage themselves into this new environment. So they're adapting to a new artificial environment.
Which is a really nice parallel with Laurel's work in the show, which also, as you describe in your presentations, focuses on instinct and adaptation. And can you maybe expand a little bit on?
Yeah, I think it's something that I try to dance around with my work, but not get. I don't want to overly anthropomorphize animals because I think then you lose a lot of what they really are. If you think they're just like us, then you're not going to learn anything from them. And in general, I'd rather try to flip it around and see where our behavior patterns come from in a more natural sense, because we just have this assumption that this is the way you're supposed to be, and this is the way it is supposed to be done. And sometimes I like to try to break that down and figure out where that came from by comparing it more to the animals than the other way around.
Petah, I was thinking particularly about No Reason Except Love, which you showed an image of and is included in the exhibition, and those two regal white peacocks that represent Tom White and Leslie Scalapino, your dear friend. Are there other examples in your work where you've selected birds to stand in for human subjects, or is that a one-off?
I think that, and probably the piece that was about my mom and dad, all those birds are, I think I had them in my head. They were all pheasants from all over the world, different ones from China and South America. And I think when I put them together, I thought of them, but I didn't think this is mom and dad. I just thought of couples, I think that was more of a one-off, most, because I don't usually think that way, because I love birds, but they have their own thing going. Yeah, I always think of them as, they always say they have all these myths about the birds take the souls to heaven, and that we each have a certain bird that is kind of shadows us, and I love these things. And that we're supposed to know instinctively what that bird is. And Tom sounds like he knows much more about birds than I do. So
but, but one of the things about birds that like that I don't just see them as sweet, and in a funny way they are dinosaurs, and they are killers. Like if a hummingbird, one of the reasons I want to make a big hummingbird was because it'd probably be the most terrifying thing on Earth, with the metabolism that it has and its voracious territorialism. I mean, if we had hummingbirds that were 5 feet tall in the United States, people would be freaked out and want to kill them. And so there's something monstrous about birds as well as beautiful. Yeah. And I'm sort of attracted to them on this this binary way. Our friend Allie, our mutual friend Allie, had a red-tailed hawk land on her air conditioner last week in Bushwick, and completely tear to ribbons this pigeon, right? And she sent me this little QuickTime video of it, and it's this bloody carnage,
Wow.
It's a beautiful pigeon flying around, being all sweet, and then it's just having its guts ripped up, So in a funny way, I see them,
Yes.
in a lot of various ways, but yeah, they can be monstrous.
Yeah.
I think. Plus, I was attacked by a goose once. And they're crotch high, so it made it extra terrifying.
Oh my God.
I don't like farm animals.
Would you like to sit down?
No, I'm
or
okay.
lay down here?
It's all right.
All right, well, before we...
My wife was with me.
Maybe
The lady,
come up
I was
there.
it was trying to attack me, and I had a lawn chair. And then the lady said, who owned the goose, said, "Put the chair down and let the goose sniff you."
And
You would
and
trust that?
And she was like, if you beat my goose, it's going to destroy you. So I put the chair down, and the goose checked me out, made sure I was subservient, and walked away. It was an attack goose. I don't like it.
We're going to see this in his next body of work.
Clearly a traumatic experience.
Traumatic bird
yeah.
experience.
All right, well, I think we're going to open it up to questions. I know we have 2 microphones in each aisle, sort of midway up. I think we're webcasting this panel discussion tonight, so if you
And we
can-
will pass out the microphones also, so that
Sorry?
people, we will pass the
Oh,
microphone.
you'll pass them, excellent,
Yes.
okay. So if you have a question, please use a microphone so that our audience who's tuning in via webcast can hear you. There's one right here in the front.
Coming out of contemporary Africa, is quite a few artists are making use of both recycled materials, and others are using natural materials, whether it's a black gabbro and then pressed flowers and things like that. And I'm just curious how much this African art of making use of recycled materials and natural materials influenced your work, if at all.
For me, I'll just say that, kind of pan-global art in general, and art history, the meeting of the East and West, primarily Persian miniatures, Rajasthani paintings, Renaissance paintings, and African art has gone in there, has all flowed into my work. But the specific use of recycled materials, while inspiring, I don't think that's really been an influence on me. What about you guys?
I would say it's very similar. I'd say the working with recycled materials comes more from just working with what's around you, what's available, and especially, coming from like working class background, you definitely make use of everything around you. But like the colors and textures and things, I definitely find inspiring.
I particularly love using recycled materials. I think there's something about the residue of stuff that's been left in them that really interests me. So if something's been broken with it or something, I don't know, it's of more interest to me than something brand new. So I particularly like it. Like all my hair came from Ann Hamilton's Dia foundation or whatever she did at Dia, and she gave me all the hair, and I particularly like that. Yeah.
Another question? Right here on the aisle.
This question is for the lady in blue. Yes, you. I loved your story about the fish, and I'd love to hear more. Like, what inspired you to buy all these fish? Were they the same type of fish? I'd love to hear more.
Oh, thank you. I was working at Chanel at the time, and I was reading a lot of, I know, and it was all about beauty and glam and stuff, and I just needed, maybe I needed a break from it, and so I would just walk, and I was reading actually a lot of Solowit's writing, and he just kept saying, like, look around, what do you see, and this will tell you what your vision was, and it was right after I finished undergraduate, and so I remember I always ended up in Chinatown, and there was all that amazing fish. I would have bought the ducks if they didn't have so much meat on them. But the fish were everywhere, and they were so beautiful. And I bought everything, flounder. I bought, baby squid. I bought the snakes, sorry. I bought, everything, and we just hung it up from the ceiling. I painted the room black, my loft, and we covered the window with black plastic, and I bought as much as I could afford. I paid the rent, paid the bills, and then all the money I had left over, I bought as many dead fish as I could, and I did that for 5 years. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Questions? Other questions? Here.
I get the sense that in each of your work, the meticulousness and the placement and the care that you put into it, that although I think you were saying, Fred, you started with kind of a conceptual framework in some of your art, I don't get the sense that, say, using assistants widely would be an approach that you use, or is that the case? How important is your actual hand in assembling your work to you in your practices?
Mine's 100% my hands, but I have a part-time studio assistant that helps out. But I do it all.
Yeah, I wish I wish I could be, someone who could turn it over to my assistants. Yeah, it's 100%. But I have a lot of assistants because there's a lot of moving, installing, making the elements. But yeah, it's 100%.
Yeah, I did have an intern help paint the fingernails for a little while, but that's been it. I think that I don't think as well if there's someone else in the room, and so having someone else there actually slows me down, and so the whole process gets slowed down. But also just explaining weird little subtleties of how I want it would take longer than doing it myself.
I wanted to ask Laurel about, I think the thing that struck me most about your talk was in terms of the adaptation suits, the sort of tension between hope and despair with environmental issues, and that's obviously, I think, something a lot of people experience, and maybe if you could sort of expand on how you work through that in your own art there.
Yeah, I think a lot of the work that I do, somewhere in the back of it, there's humor, whether anybody else sees it or not. At least I do. But yeah, I don't want to work on environmental subjects without that, because it would just be too bleak. And I think for any environmentalist who just stops and really thinks about all the things that are going wrong, that makes it stops you in your tracks, and then you're not really able to go about your own life or do anything proactive. So I'm trying to find ways to work around that, and be able to keep making work, and I really do want there to be hope. I do have hope, so I want my work to communicate that. And humor is definitely a good way to do it, I think.
Maybe one more question?
Fred, I just wanted to know on the on some of the pieces, it looks like there are like 3 or 4 layers, and I just wondered if you could explain the process. I see that you use like a crystal acrylic, but do you do layers of glass behind that? I don't know if that's something you can talk about.
Yeah, I like keeping the viewer a little off balance as to the nature of the reality of the things they're seeing. So sometimes it's a little hard to tell the difference between photographic, painterly, and real objects. And I feel like that discombobulates perception just slightly. And the same would go for the various dimensionality in the work. Like I like having slightly different focal points for the eyeball, and that comes about through just through the process itself, just through me exploiting inherent properties of the resin. As I pile it up, I'll sand it down and then paint on a layer, and then pile up some more resin and sand that down, then paint over the layer, and sort of build up, a very shallow, almost, relief that's dead flat, right? And I guess that I like how that works, but I also like the fact that it can't be photographed, and that phenomenon can only be experienced in reality. You have to see the real thing, and there's something kind of uncanny now about seeing images, real things in a world that's like flooding, that we're drowning in images, but to have this real thing with its own presence, to me is, just strange and cool, So that's why I do it. But it does come out of the natural properties of the resin. It's just me exploiting that.
We have our last question right up here.
Hi, this is a question for Fred. In the last piece that you showed us with the two long-tailed birds, I just wondered, it looked to my eyes like there might have been an influence with astronomy, and it looked like there might be an influence with astronomy.
Astronomy.
Perhaps, like in the background, there seemed to be stars. I wondered maybe if constellations were an influence, at least in that piece, or maybe a connection with the sky, astronomy, birds.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I've done a lot of work with the cosmos. I wasn't able to show any of it because of the brevity of our little presentations, but I've done chemical celestial portraits based on astrology, where I've asked sitters to give me their drug history plus their birth date, and that ended up becoming these constellations that were renamed with all the drugs they'd ever taken. So it became a chemical celestial portrait, a portrait of inner space and outer space. I've chopped up the heavens into a sculpture called Cubic Sky, where I've taken the infinite and then confined it and made it finite. The stars have been coming up in and around my work since the mid-'80s. It's this mysterious cosmic thing that, and great, interesting things happen at night. So, yeah, it's always there. So, yeah. I think man's oldest way of turning his back on the world is looking up into the sky. So maybe that's where it all starts.
That was a perfect end to
Yes.
this panel discussion.
There you go.
Thank you.
So funny.
Thanks very much.
Perfect.
That was perfect. All right, you're done.
Perfect.